I'm Grace Cowell.
I'm Grace Curtis.
And you're watching G2 News.
Lights. Camera.
Action!
In international news, a few weeks ago, we saw another attack on Palestine by Israeli forces. Before we get into what is happening today, we wanted to provide a bit of context because the situation between Israel and Palestine is one that stems back many years.
Although tensions began prior, conflict was officially solidified in Palestine following the dissolvement of the Ottoman Empire in 1922, a few years after the end of World War I. As the majority of Ottoman territories became independent states, Great Britain was ordered by the League of Nations to be the temporary mandatory power over Palestine until their independence was officially recognized.
Despite their responsibilities to help Palestine become an independent Arab state, British powers made promises to Zionist leaders to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. Under the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the creation of this Jewish state was solidified. However, it did not provide Palestinian Arabs with any self-determination, leading to an influx of pushback.
At that time, Palestine consisted of an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. However, the Jewish population increased significantly from the 1920s to the 1940s, especially due to the persecution faced during the Holocaust. As more Jews migrated to Palestine, they established a firm, settled community, but this came at the expense of Palestinians who lost their jobs and were pushed off their land.
Tensions rose between the two groups and against British rule as the first Arab revolt occurred in 1936. Following the revolt, the British government declared that Palestine would not align with either side and would instead become an independent state within the next 10 years.
In 1947, when Britain turned the conflict over to the United Nations, it was decided the best solution was to divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Palestinian, with Jerusalem, a holy city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, left as an international city. Palestinians rejected this plan since they received less land than the Jewish minority and felt their natural rights had been violated.
In 1948, the British left Palestine and Zionist leaders established the State of Israel, sparking a war between Israel and Palestine. Many Palestinians were forced from their homes, and by the end of the war in 1949, Israel had gained control over the majority of Palestinian land.
After the conclusion of the war, most of the Palestinians who had fled found themselves in Gaza and the West Bank, unable to return to their homes that were now a part of Israeli territory.
Fast forward to today, Israel continues to occupy the West Bank, and despite them pulling out of Gaza, this Palestinian region is still considered an occupied territory.
Gaza has been ruled by the Palestinian militant group Hamas since 2007. Hamas and Israel have fought many times, most recently in May of 2021. Israeli forces have tightly restricted Gaza's borders to prevent Hamas from receiving weapons and other military tools. But as a result, other resources needed by civilians have been restricted.
There has been a little reconstruction in Gaza since the bombings and attacks of last year. Citizens can only get 4 hours of electricity a day after Gaza's one power plant came to a stop due to lack of fuel from Israel's blockade, and only 1 in every 10 Palestinians has access to drinking water. This is especially dangerous as they are experiencing intense heat wave. The unemployment rate in Palestine sits around 50% as work permits are difficult to receive from Israel, leaving Palestine in a state of severe poverty.
On Friday, August 5th, fighting began between Israel and the Palestinian militant group Islamic Jihad. Both the Islamic Jihad commanders of the northern and southern regions of Gaza have been killed during a wave of airstrikes from Israel. In retaliation, the militant group launched rockets into Israel. Despite their history with Israel, Hamas has decided to sit out of this current conflict.
These attacks lasted throughout the weekend, with a ceasefire being reached on Sunday, August 7th. After militant bases and many residential areas were flattened due to airstrikes, the Palestinian death toll has climbed to nearly 50, with over a dozen of those killings being children.
Despite this ceasefire, the situation between Israel and Palestine continues to be an ongoing conflict.
Moving on to national news, the House passed an extensive tax, health, and climate bill called the Inflation Reduction Act. On August 12th, this bill went into the Senate and received 220 votes yea and 207 votes nay, also 4 non-voters, thus sending the Inflation Reduction Act to the President.
This bill includes $375 billion over the next 10 years to encourage greener forms of energy. $4 million is going to California to help with drought, while $64 billion will help 13 million people pay premiums over the next 3 years for privately bought health insurance.
This bill will also lower prices of select drugs and will allow seniors better access to health care. Insulin for seniors cannot exceed $35 a month. For those with Medicare, the prescription drug copay cannot exceed $2,000 a year. This bill also allows our government the freedom to negotiate costs for prescription drugs, no matter the price.
The Inflation Reduction Act marks the greatest amount of money put into climate change in American history. During the pandemic in 2020, carbon emissions declined by 10%. However, in the following year, emissions were back up to 6.2%. Over the past century, the planet has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius.
America has produced roughly 8 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from 1850 to 2014, the most out of the world's countries. This act is hoping to make electric vehicles and natural energy more affordable and has hopes to lower carbon emissions by 40% by 2030.
This act will also affect taxes and will create more jobs for the American citizens. Over the next 10 years, the IRS will receive $80 billion to deal with taxes. Big businesses will be taxed more heavily, while smaller businesses with less revenue will not lose as much in taxes. The lower class will not experience heavy tax change, but the middle and upper class will face higher taxes.
Lastly, for today's local news portion, we will be covering the Maryland state primary elections. This past July, Maryland held the primary election, collecting and tallying votes from thousands of people.
Candidates from the Republican and Democratic parties for governor, comptroller, attorney general, U.S. senator, House of Delegates, and the judge for the circuit court were elected during the primaries. These elected candidates from each party will now move on to the general election, where the final leaders are chosen.
Yes, Maryland is the closed primary state, meaning that voters must choose a party and can only vote within their party. Maryland voters who are unaffiliated with the Republican or Democratic Party do not get to vote in the primaries. However, they do get to vote in the following gubernatorial general election. Voters can vote by participating in early voting, election day voting, or mail-in ballots.
This primary produced 2 winners for the governor and lieutenant governor of Maryland, along with candidates for the other positions previously stated. The elected governor of the state ensures the execution of state laws and oversees the work done by the state executive branch.
The lieutenant governor, who runs alongside the candidate governor, is the reserve and will act as governor if the current governor is unable to do the job or passes away. Maryland's current governor is Larry Hogan, who is a member of the Republican Party and has been in office since 2015.
As primary voting has closed, the winning Republican governor candidate is Dan Cox, with Gordana Schiffinelli as his lieutenant. Cox and Schiffinelli won 52% of the votes, consisting of 153,430 voters. Kelly Schultz and Jeff Wolford were runners-up to Cox and Schiffinelli, with 43.48% of votes.
The winning Democratic governor candidate is Wes Moore and Arona Miller for lieutenant governor. Moore and Miller won the 32.41% of the votes, consisting of 217,524 votes. Following Moore and Miller is Tom Perez and Shannon Sneed, who got 30.12% of votes.
The general elections will take place later this year in order to elect the final new government officials. Early voting will occur from October 27th to November 2nd. The official gubernatorial general election day is November 8th, 2022.
Mail-in ballot voting is an option as well. If you are 18 years or older, you have the ability to vote in the upcoming general election. If you plan to vote, you must register by October 18th, 2022.
Thank you for joining us today for the August episode of G2 News.
The sources used for this episode and all of our social media accounts will be linked in the description box below.
We encourage all of you to continue researching these topics and more.
We hope you tune in again next month.
Bye!